Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evan Weiner, and it's been a long time since I've seen you. The last time I was at the H-Chair was in February of 2020, and we're going to start off with the space race in 1961. A whole bunch of things happened in 1961 that impact you to this day, including that guy being elected President of the United States and being sworn in as the 35th President of the United States, John Kennedy. Also that year, well, a threat from Cuba, 90 miles away. Fidel Castro's in his third year leading Cuba, and things are getting worse between the United States and Cuba. The civil rights movement continues. There is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King being interviewed during one of his marches down in the South. Adolf Eichmann is tried for war crimes. He's captured by Israeli agents in Argentina and is brought back to Israel. Vietnam, oh, that's out there. There is John Kennedy pointing to a map from December 20th of 1960 explaining why the United States needs to be in Vietnam. The Cold War picks up even more. The Berlin Wall is being constructed in 1961 to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. And this guy who is still around, he's in Milwaukee now. His name is Newton Minow, M-I-N-O-W. Newton Minow, he was the head or the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. And in 1961, he delivers a talk about TV before the Senate and the House about what he thought of TV, and what he thought of TV was it was a vast wasteland. So let's say goodbye to Dwight Eisenhower. Let's say hello to John Kennedy. Dwight Eisenhower was ending his second term as the President of the United States on January 20th, 1961. But in his final days as president, Eisenhower makes a very, very critical decision. On January 3rd, 1961, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. In 1956, Fidel Castro and his associates tried a guerrilla warfare as a way of toppling the dictator, Batista. But Batista was our dictator, our being the United States, because he was anti-communism, and he also was assisted by the American mafia in Havana. But by 1959, Castro and his associates brought down Batista, and Castro would turn to the Soviet Union for help. The Cold War was just 90 miles away from the United States, and I was 4 and 5 years old back in 1961, and I remember things like fallout shelters and how the threat of nuclear war seemed to overhang whatever we were doing. The 1960 election had a lot in common with the 2020 election because there was a question about voting and voting fraud. Here is John Kennedy meeting with Richard Nixon. The plan after the election, after Kennedy had won, Nixon did concede, was somehow to whisk the presidency away from John Kennedy. It was a tight presidential race, and Kennedy won with votes that put him over the top out of Chicago. But there was a group of politicians, most of them in the South, who were not very happy and decided to contest the race. The group was made up of white conservative electors from the South who opposed JFK's quote-unquote liberal policies, especially his support for civil rights for Black Americans. John Kennedy helped get Martin Luther King out of jail after a sit-in at a restaurant counter at Rich's department store in Atlanta. And I guess that's what they were opposed about. The Republicans claimed there was voter fraud in 11 states and filed suit in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois. Kennedy won those states by fewer than 9,000 votes. The suit in Illinois charged that the Democratic stronghold of Cook County, Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley, had dug up Kennedy voters from the cemeteries of Chicago. I knew Nixon. I dealt with Nixon in 1985. He settled the baseball umpires dispute and dealt with him for about 4 years afterwards. And I had heard stories that Nixon didn't contest Chicago because he had wired Southern Illinois with his people. So he felt that it was futile to do that. The judges threw out both suits. Nixon took no part in the vote challenges and told a reporter, our country can't afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. So topple JFK, try to get rid of John Kennedy if possible. Come up with a plan. Well, there were a bunch of plans on the table to get rid of John Kennedy as the president-elect of the United States. One, go after the Electoral College. Electors from Alabama and Mississippi did not cast their votes for Kennedy, who had won both states. Mississippi's 8 electors and 6 of Alabama's 11 electors in the Electoral College were unpledged. They weren't going to vote for him, faithless voters. The electors decided, let's see what we could do with our counterparts in other states to aid and abet the plan. Plan A, well, the electors from 11 southern states would use their clout to persuade Kennedy to stop aid to communist countries and more or less don't deal with the Soviet Union, and there was no dealing with communist or Red China at the time. But more importantly, support states' rights. Support states' rights. What is a code, or was a code, may still be a code today, resisting racial integration. Well, if Kennedy couldn't be persuaded, so let's go on to Plan B, which would be a resolution calling for the reversing of the positions of the candidates who won in the election. That would be Lyndon Johnson from Texas, would be the president-elect. He was the vice president-elect. And Kennedy would be the vice president. But that too didn't fly. How about a third choice? How about President Harry Byrd? Harry Byrd was a legitimate choice of these people to be president of the United States. He was a Virginia senator. This was the Plan C. Republican electors from all 50 states would meet in Chicago to pick a president from a list of quote-unquote outstanding Southern men. Among the choices, the Virginia senator, Harry Byrd, segregationist governors, Orville Farbus of Arkansas, Russ Barnett of Mississippi, and Georgia Senator Richard Russell. Byrd would get 15 electoral votes, the 8 Mississippi, the 6 from Alabama, and 1 from Oklahoma in the 1960 election. But Kennedy would prevail. He would get 303 Electoral College votes, 34,227,096 votes. Nixon would get 219 Electoral College votes, 34,107,646. And Byrd only got 116,248 votes during the election. He was a Democrat, but he got 15 electoral votes. What these people wanted to do after all their plans were failed, or A, B, and C, Plan A, B, and C, they wanted to cast doubt over Kennedy's victory and create a perception that John Kennedy's presidency would have some sort of illegitimacy. They failed in 1960-61. The civil rights movement, and that woman who's sitting in that car, you may have seen on PBS. This woman was Charlene Hunter, the age of 18. She went on to a magnificent career in journalism and other things. Charlene Hunter Galt. On January 11th, she wanted to go to the University of Georgia. But on January 12th, she left Georgia for her own protection because students engaged in an uprising against integration. They did not want Charlene Hunter, who was only 18 years of age at the time, attending the University of Georgia. And there is Dr. Charlene Hunter Galt, journalist, and you might have seen her on Channel 13 or Channel 21 on the News Hour or whatever other show that she contributed to on PBS. Eisenhower says goodbye to the country, a country he had served during World War II as a general, as president of the United States between 1953 and 1961. He says goodbye January 17th, 1961. At that time, he was the oldest man who ever served as president of the United States at the age of 70. On January 17th, 1961, Ike ends his presidential term by issuing a warning that the nation should listen to about the increasing power of the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower says, as we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without asking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. And there is John Kennedy meeting with Dwight Eisenhower, going from the oldest president to the youngest elected president, Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after McKinley was assassinated, was the youngest president in age. But Kennedy was the youngest ever to be voted in to the Oval Office at the age of 43. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you could do for your country. It's the thing that's remembered most from his inaugural address, and many people thought it was an original thought by probably Theodore Sorensen, who wrote the speech. Theodore Sorensen did a lot of Kennedy's writings. But apparently Kennedy went to school, and at one of these schools, these prep schools that he went to, there was a guy who ran the school. Ask not what you could do for the school, ask not what your school could do for you, ask what you could do for your school. And he just put it into the talk. And there is Kennedy with Carolyn Kennedy and John, and the pony, Yankee Doodle, which roamed the White House for Carolyn. The new frontier had come. At the age of 43, the youngest man ever elected president of the United States, and in Kennedy's case, image was everything. You might remember John Kennedy. He had thick hair. He wore cool sunglasses. Jackie, his stylish wife, about 32 years old at the time. He has 2 small children. There were touch football games up at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. He was a World War II hero. He saved his men after his patrol boat was sunk, although all the years later, there's some question about how much of a hero he really was. But anyway, he did save his men after the patrol boat was sunk back in World War II. Image is everything, and they had the image of that beautiful power couple. There's Kennedy with his hair, every hair in place, neatly dressed, and there's Jackie with the pillbox, blue hat here, and the stylish clothes, and she is young. And it's a new generation that's taken over. The Eisenhower generation, the World War II generation, gone. But actually, Kennedy was World War II generation. He served there. And Kennedy was a Cold War warrior. And he was against the Soviet Union and against China. So he fit in rather well with the Cold War. JFK's world, your world too, back in 1961. The Cold War with the Soviet Union. Cuba, extension of the Cold War, also 90 miles away. The Civil Rights Movement, which started with Rosa Parks in 1956, the modern one, although it goes back to 1941 with Randolph and Franklin Roosevelt, with Randolph asking Roosevelt to allow Negroes to work on defense projects, hire Negroes for that. Vietnam, of course, and the space race. The space race, I thought the space race was cool when I was a kid watching the astronauts go up, but little did I realize at that time that the space race was just another part of the Cold War. Adolf Eichmann, he came up with the final solution, as you might know, during the Holocaust for Adolf Hitler's Germany. On May 23rd, 1960, the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced that the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured and would stand trial in Israel. Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer, and you got to remember at this point, it's only 15, 16 years out from World War II and finding out about the concentration camps. The Nazi SS officer organized Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question. He was seized by Israeli agents in Argentina on May 11th, 1960, smuggled to Israel 9 days later. Back in 1982, I produced a show with a rabbi named Jack Spivak. And one of his guests on the show, which was called Jewish Visions, which was shown on local cable access in Manhattan. If we were around today, you would have been able to see it. Unfortunately, the tape doesn't exist. I do, because I was producer of the show, have an audio of it. It was a really interesting show because the guy who actually caught Eichmann was on the show and explained how the secret mission came about, and that was in 1982, and I should probably find that tape somewhere and play it for some people. It's an interesting tape. Anyway, the trial, April 11th, 1961, the trial begins in Jerusalem. It was the first trial ever to be televised in history. Eichmann only faced 15 charges: crimes against humanity, crimes against Jewish people, war crimes. He claimed, "I was just following orders," but the judge disagreed, finding him guilty on all counts. On December 15th, 1961, he's sentenced to die. On May 31st, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged near Tel Aviv. His body subsequently cremated, his ashes thrown into the sea. One of his 4 children has felt guilt about this. The other 3, just, no big deal. One of the children has denounced Eichmann. Kennedy's first mass failure as president is the Bay of Pigs invasion on April 17th, 1961. And 60 years later, the Bay of Pigs is still fresh in the memory of Cubans who live in Miami, and also Cubans on the Isle of Cuba. The Eisenhower administration actually started this in 1960. They got about 1,500 Cuban exiles, and the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, started training them. And the goal was to storm the beach in Cuba's Bay of Pigs and take over the island. It was part of a secret mission to overthrow Fidel Castro and halt the spread of communism throughout the world. It's failed spectacularly, and here's why. The mission was set into motion on April 15th with a series of airstrikes which were designed to take out Castro's defenses. The plan was not executed well. Missed Cuban planes. On the next day, April 16th, JFK canceled the second series of airstrikes, and that probably was the Achilles heel in this mission, because these guys hit the beach and they have no air support. Castro, watching during the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. Without air support, most of the April 17th invaders were taken prisoners. 90 of them were killed. Castro would become entrenched. The ties with the Soviet Union would strengthen, and right now, remember in 1960, Kennedy ran on the basis that he felt the Soviets had more missiles than the Americans, and he ran on the missile gap, and that the Americans had to strengthen their missiles to catch up with the Soviets. The Cuban exiled invaders were released from Cuban prisons in 62 through 65. They cut a deal with the Americans. Cuba would get $53 million worth of food and medicine. Castro ended elections after the Bay of Pigs invasion. That's the civil rights movement, and that is an orange and black bus line. And the Freedom Riders starting in 1961. Freedom wheels are rolling, and the Freedom Riders came from outside of the South to help African Americans, Negroes, back in 1961, get civil rights with demonstrations. The Freedom Riders rode interstate buses into segregated southern United States areas starting in 1961 to challenge the non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decisions, Morgan against Virginia in 1946, Boynton versus Virginia in 1960, which ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. The southern states had ignored the rulings of the federal government, whether it was Eisenhower or going back to Truman, even going back to Harry Truman, just ignored it, didn't do anything. The first Freedom Ride left Washington, D.C. on December 4th. It was going to take 13 days, and then they were going to get to New Orleans, but they never got there. Why? There was violence on the way. A bus here carrying them, a Greyhound bus, firebombed. That was Mother's Day, May 14th. In rural Alabama, angry white people blocked a Greyhound bus carrying black and white passengers. The attackers pelted the vehicle with rocks, bricks, slashed its tires, smashed windows with pipes and axes, and lobbed a firebomb through a broken window. As smoke and flames filled the bus, the mob barricaded the door. "Burn them alive," somebody cried out. But they got out. Meanwhile, this guy who passed away last year, Congressman John Lewis, he's an 18, 19-year-old guy going to college in the South, but he heavily gets involved with a group called SNCC. And SNCC is a civil rights group. He's arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, also protesting the South, Jim Crow laws. They weren't really laws, they were just customs. On May 24th, 1961, Martin Luther King is in Atlanta. He wants to join the Freedom Riders and buy a bus ticket. But you know, at that point, interstate busing, you couldn't have interstate busing carrying blacks and whites together, even though you weren't supposed to. But nobody enforced any of those laws, so he's taking a big risk going on the bus. John Kennedy was very slow to react to the civil rights movement, but yet in 1960, he campaigned on doing something. And in October of 1960, he called Coretta Scott King, the wife of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., after he was imprisoned at the Rich department store, sitting at the lunch counter, on trumped-up charges. They said he violated probation since he had been arrested earlier that year. So he leads the sit-in. Robert Kennedy, the campaign manager and then future attorney general, made a call to get MLK out of jail the next day. Funny enough, Nixon didn't say anything about the call. But in 1961, JFK really sat on his hands and did nothing about housing segregation or any other segregation. In November of 1961, Robert Kennedy's May 29th memo to end segregation of interstate busing took effect, which allowed people from the North to go to the South and join in on the demonstrations. Vietnam is accelerating. In 1960, Dwight Eisenhower did tell John Kennedy that maybe going to need to send some troops there. But oddly enough, Vietnam wasn't the biggest problem in Southeast Asia, because there's a meeting between Eisenhower and Kennedy the day before Kennedy takes over in the Oval Office. And Eisenhower does not mention Vietnam as one of the major problems. Instead, neighboring Laos, he thought was the key to maintaining status quo, at least status quo in Southeast Asia, because Eisenhower thought that Laos was a weak country, and letting it fall would begin the loss of most countries in the Far East to communism. Kennedy was determined not to let South Vietnam fall. And here's the domino theory. Here you go. You got communist China, which would knock off South Korea, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, India, and who knows, maybe even Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. 1954, the French pull out of Vietnam, go elsewhere. And since they do pull out of Vietnam, the country splits in half, North and the South. North run by the communist Ho Chi Minh, South run by a guy by the name of Diem, who's Dwight Eisenhower's guy. Eisenhower thinks, well, if we lose Vietnam or South Vietnam to communist control, communists would win in Southeast Asia, in Laos, and Cambodia, Thailand, maybe India, maybe Japan, maybe the Philippines, maybe Indonesia, and even Australia and New Zealand. He said the possible consequences of the loss are just incalculable to the free world. But Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, he's not listening much to Ike. He's going to say, well, he did say that the Soviets would support wars of national liberation throughout the world. 1960 was a big year for independence in Africa. And Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader, is listening to what Nikita Khrushchev has to say. And Kennedy is determined not to lose South Vietnam. The troops are going in. Kennedy sends 400 American Green Beret advisors to South Vietnam to train South Vietnamese soldiers in the methods of counterinsurgency in its fight against Viet Cong guerrillas. And the expansion continues. October 24th, 1961, on the 6th anniversary of the Republic of South Vietnam, Kennedy sends a letter to Diem and pledges the United States is determined to help Vietnam preserve its independence. And he would send additional military advisors, helicopter units, and direct South Vietnamese troops in battle. Kennedy wants to prevent a communist takeover of Vietnam, which he said was in accordance to the policy of the US government that had been followed since 1954. In 1954, my father told me he was in the US Army. He fully expected to go to Vietnam, which meant you wouldn't be listening to me probably today. If he did go to Vietnam, you'd be listening to somebody else. But he never did, and he got out of the Army in 1955. Meanwhile, Korea has still not been settled, and it has not been settled to this day. There was just a truce in 1953 signed between North Korea and the United States, and here's a skirmish on the DMZ between American troops and North Korean troops. That is something else that's on Kennedy's plate. The space race. The space race. Well, the space race. 1957, 58, Soviets launched Sputnik. That was the first artificial satellite in space. Man would enter space in 1961. Yuri Gagarin, about 60 years ago, next week, is the first man to go around the Earth in a 5-ton ship. The Soviets beat the Americans, getting Sputnik into space October 4th, 1957. April the 12th, the Soviet cosmonaut Gagarin was the first human in space, a 108-minute suborbital flight in Vostok 1. The Mercury astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, but he really didn't go into space. He did a 15-minute suborbital flight, and that would be a month later. And there is Gagarin, along with Brezhnev, the Soviet vice premier. Khrushchev was the premier in those days. May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard does blast off. It was pretty funny on the launch pad. First of all, he wanted to go to the bathroom. They said, no, you can't. And then secondly, he was talking about this was a government job and that he was sitting on a pile of the lowest bidders who put the rocket together. So he didn't know what was going on because they were the lowest bidders. But he did get into space, or did attempt to get into space. It was only a 15-minute flight, up, down, recovered. Gus Grissom would do the same later that year. And JFK decides the space program and the space race is a big deal, but not for the reasons you thought, because he really didn't care what was going on day-to-day, nuts and bolts going on in the space program. And there he is pinning a medal onto Alan Shepard, and there are a bunch of astronauts behind him, including John Glenn and Gordon Cooper and Scott Carpenter. And there's Werner von Braun, the German who came over to the United States to run the space program. So here Shepard's getting a medal. But the United States is still lagging. First in space, Soviets. First man in space, Soviets. First probe going to Venus, Soviets. and the missile gap becomes the space gap. And by May 25th, 1961, Kennedy decides announces before a special joint session of Congress the goal of sending an American safely to the moon before the end of the decade. Kennedy felt great pressure to have the United States to catch up and overtake the Soviet Union in the space race. Sounds like the missile gap stuff. The space race was part of the Cold War, and America, at least by the token, they didn't have anybody orbit the Earth. They didn't have a spacecraft going to Venus. They didn't have the first spacecraft aimed at the moon, and Sputnik was up first. America was losing. There's supposed to be a June summit talk between Nikita Khrushchev, seen here on the right, and John Kennedy. And there was. And Nikita Khrushchev takes John Kennedy to school. On June 4th, Kennedy and Khrushchev meet at the Vienna summit in Austria. It's all down to goodnight Vienna. Kennedy told the New York Times reporter of the experience, "He savaged me." Khrushchev said, "This man is very inexperienced, even immature." Compared to him, Eisenhower is a man of intelligence and vision. There is a pattern beginning in the Kennedy White House. Kennedy knew everything. He did not listen to his advisors. Bay of Pigs, they told him, "You need air cover." This summit meeting, don't talk about things. Don't waste your time. Don't debate communist ideology. But he did. And he had a lot of discussions about Marxism, which wasted time, and spent a lot of time defending pre-World War II status quo, British imperialism. And he also makes a fatal mistake here. Well, it wasn't fatal, but it's a big error. He tells Khrushchev that he thought Sino-Soviet forces and U.S. Western European forces were about the same. But it's a bomb, total bomb. Kennedy and Khrushchev continued to communicate, with both eventually coming to the understanding that neither wanted nuclear war. But in the summer of 1961, Kennedy was preparing for nuclear war. On a July 25th speech, Kennedy emphasizes that any attack on Berlin is an attack on NATO. In 1949, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States founded the alliance. 3 other members were added: Greece and Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1955. 2 weeks later, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, tells NATO, "Be prepared for anything." The Berlin Wall construction begins August 13th of 1961, as you can see there. The very start of it, designed to keep Eastern Berliners from defecting to the West. The construction of the wall started by East Germany, German Democratic Republic, August 13th. The wall cut off West Berlin from surrounding East Germany, and that included East Berlin. The barrier included guard towers, large concrete walls accompanied by a wide area that contained anti-vehicle trenches, a bed of nails, and other defenses, so people cannot leave Eastern Germany and go to the West. And there are some of the workers putting up the Berlin Wall. Why the wall, you ask? Well, 1955, the Soviets gave East Germany authority over the civilian movement in Berlin, passing control to a regime not recognized in the West. Initially, East Germany granted visits to allow residents access to West Germany, which included seeing your family or working. However, following the defection of a large number of East Germans, the new East German state legally restricted virtually all travel to the West, including West Berlin, in 1956. And there's another picture of the wall. With the closing of the east-west sector boundary in Berlin, the vast majority of East Germans could no longer travel or emigrate to West Germany. Families were split. East Berliners employed in the West lost their jobs. West Berlin became an isolated enclave or exclave in a hostile land. West Berliners really were upset by the wall, and Willy Brandt, who is the mayor of West Berlin, strongly criticized Kennedy in the United States for not failing to respond. So the Bay of Pigs lost. East Germany about ready to be lost. But the wall didn't stop people from jumping over, as this guy did jump over. Hey, there's Times Square. That's in the middle of 1961, and there's a guard dog right in the middle of Times Square with a cop. Bond, I remember Bond clothes, do you? Bond clothes, 2-trouser suit, Woolworths down there, and the Astor Hotel. That is Times Square in 1961, and it is empty. And it is empty for a reason, because you were supposed to hide under desks, fallout shelters, like I did in 1961 in 5th grade, and drove Mrs. Topar crazy. Hey, you know, why am I under the desk here? Why am I just, you know, if the bomb's going to hit, it's going to hit. You know, being under a desk isn't going to help me. Fallout shelters. Schools were fallout shelters. But if you subscribe to Life magazine in 1961, you got a letter from the President of the United States. About 3-4 million people who subscribed to Life. And it wasn't, hey, how you doing? Not at all. It was, well, let me read it. My fellow Americans, nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war are facts of life we cannot ignore today. In other words, the news wasn't good. Get prepared. The federal government would soon begin a program to improve protection afforded to you in your communities through civil defense. Fallout shelters. They weren't going to protect people from exploding bombs, but people away from the bomb might get some protection from bomb materials that were scattered for weeks after an attack. There'd be some food in the shelter, other necessities too. On October 29th, the USSR detonated a 50-megaton hydrogen bomb in the largest man-made explosion in history. That is a fancier fallout shelter. They got a bed there, they got a bed there, they got a bed there, bed there. You got your canned water, you got your canned food, you got a whole bunch of things that you and your family living on top of one another could do in a fallout shelter trying to escape a nuclear bomb. Goodbye, goodbye, good riddance to Joseph Stalin. But he had been dead 8 years already. Goodbye, Uncle Joe. The Soviet Party Congress unanimously approved a resolution removing Stalin's body from Lenin's tomb in Moscow's Red Square as part of a de-Stalinization effort. Stalin was dead in 1953. I don't know how many of you remember the Peace Corps or how many of you had friends in the Peace Corps. I don't think I had any friends in the Peace Corps who went to the Peace Corps in the 1960s, or I don't think I know of anybody who was in the Peace Corps. But this was designed by Sergeant Shriver and the Kennedy administration to get rid of that ugly American stigma that Americans have, those damn Yankees. March 1st, 1961, Kennedy signs Executive Order 10924, officially starts the Peace Corps. He's concerned with the growing tide of revolutionary sentiment in the Third World. Kennedy saw the Peace Corps as a means of countering the stereotype of ugly American and Yankee imperialism, especially in emergent nations in post-colonial Africa and Asia. Kennedy appoints his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to be the program's first director. The Peace Corps comes out of Cold War. It was created to win the hearts and minds of the non-aligned developing countries of 1960. 17 countries declared independence in Africa alone in 1960. The continent was beginning to face the realities of post-colonial violence. And in 1960, South African apartheid, there was opposition to the South African apartheid government. In 1960, all of the colonies of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa became independent. Ghana was the first country to get Peace Corps volunteers. The first group of volunteers arrived there August 30th. By the end of the year, 500 Peace Corps volunteers were serving in 9 countries: Chile, Colombia, South America, Ghana, Africa, India, Asia, Nigeria, Africa, the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean, St. Lucia, which is in the Caribbean, Tanzania, Africa, and Pakistan, in between sort of Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, Nikita Khrushchev didn't think highly of the Peace Corps. He thought the young kids serving were spies. Back in the USA, there was George Lincoln Rockwell's hate bus, head of the Nazi Party in the United States. We do hate race mixing. George Lincoln Rockwell's hate bus, filling up for gas at Texaco. You could trust your car to the man who wears the star. This is Joan Trompiard, and she was a freedom rider who was protesting in the South. She's arrested in Jackson, Mississippi on June 8th, 1961. She was a Duke student. She was a part-time secretary in the Washington office of Senator Claire Engel of California. She arrives in Jackson, Mississippi on June 4th. Take part in the Mississippi Freedom Ride. She and 8 others were arrested, refused bail. She served 3 months in jail, later enrolled in a traditionally black college, Tougaloo, which had just started accepting white students. The Albany Movement was actually one of the successes of the civil rights movement in 1961-62. The Albany Movement began in November. It was the first mass movement in the modern civil rights era to have as its goal the desegregation of an entire community, and it resulted in the jailing of more than 1,000 African Americans in the city and surrounding counties. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King came down there in December 1961 when hundreds of black protesters, including himself, were arrested in 1 week. But he would leave 8 months later, and he admitted that his part to help out and meet some goals failed. But some goals were made. Voter registration was increased in Georgia. And now, of course, in the last week, you've had a lot of news about the new Georgia election law. African-American businessman Thomas Chapman secured enough votes in the election for a city commission seat in 1961 to force a runoff election the following spring. The Albany City Commission removed all segregation statutes from their books. The courts in 1961 in New Rochelle, May 31st, Judge Irving Kaufman orders Board of Ed of New Rochelle to integrate. I was just in New Rochelle yesterday, visited Thomas Paine's cottage. In Gardner versus Louisiana, the court overturned the disturbing the peace convictions of 5 African Americans who engaged in a sit-in at an all-white restaurant counter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On September 20th, 1961, James Meredith, a student at the all-black Jackson State College, filed a lawsuit against the University of Mississippi alleging racial discrimination. The case was eventually settled on appeal by the U.S. Supreme Court, which allowed Meredith to go to the school, or at least enroll in the school, in September of 1962. Hey, this is a fascist, Francisco Franco of Spain. You would never think Francisco Franco of Spain would be a civil rights pioneer. And yet, he is. Spain, equal rights for women in the workplace, passed July 22nd, 1961. The United States does not have equal rights for women in the workplace. The fascist leader, Francisco Franco, a change in the law made it easier for women to gain employment in the public sector. Women had faced many restrictions, including the need for their husbands to approve the job that they were taking before allowing them to sign an employment contract. That was gone. The 1961 law gave women in the workplace additional rights that they had previously lacked by recognizing the importance of their work. This law entitled single women to a salary equal to that of her male peers working in the same job. Some other things going on that year: the 23rd Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified, allowing the residents of Washington, D.C. to vote in presidential elections. 60 years later, Congress may be taking up the question of whether Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, should be a state or not. Now it's just a federal district. April 13th, 1961, a coup against Antonio de Aguilera Salazar fails in Portugal. The beginning of problems in the Dominican Republic, which would last a number of years. A military uprising overthrows the Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic, and there are various wars and revolts in Africa. The Middle East. Hey, we're not talking about Israel here. We're not talking about Israel at all here. June 24th, the Iraqi government says they're going to invade Kuwait. And that invasion, because they thought it was a province of Iraq, the invasion was averted following plans by the Arab League to form an international Arab force against Iraqi designs on Kuwait. That idea would not go away for 3 decades. On September 28th, there was a military coup in Damascus, Syria, which ended the United Arab Republic, the union between Egypt and Syria. That is Newton Minow. Newton Minow, who was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, and he's talking about TV in 1961. It's called the Vast Wasteland Speech, Television and the Public Interest. Minow said commercial television landscape was a vast wasteland, advocated instead for public service television. Minow successfully encouraged CBS, NBC, and ABC to expand their nightly news programs from 15 minutes to a half hour. He also pushed for educational TV. Edward R. Murrow would introduce educational TV in New York WNET in 1962. And people sat around the TV, which you might have. I did that back in 1961 as a 4 or 5-year-old, and watched The Vast Wasteland. And Minow brings this point up. He talks about why he called it a vast wasteland. You will see a procession of game shows, formula comedies about totally unbelievable families, blood and thunder, mayhem, violence, sadism, murder, Western bad men, Western good men, private eyes, gangsters, more violence in cartoons, and endlessly commercials, many screaming, cajoling, and offending. And most of all, boredom. True, you'll see a few things you will enjoy, but they will be very, very few. And if you think I exaggerate, I only ask you to try it. Now, I don't know how many people in 1961 tried it. Certainly I didn't, because I was watching Channel 5 all the time, because I was watching Sonny Fox or Sandy Becker on WNEW in those days, and watching cartoons just for fun, Wonderama, Sandy Becker show with Nork. But I look at TV back from those days, and he's partially right. Also, between 1961 and say 1965 was television's golden age of dramas. Oh, and that's the Minow too, M-I-N-N-O-W, as opposed to Newton, who spelled his word M-I-N-O-W. That's the skipper of the ship that was shipwrecked on an uncharted desert island somewhere, with Gilligan, Skipper 2, the Millionaires, the actress, and the professor and Mary Ann, Gilligan's Island. The TV show, Gilligan's Island, the boat on the TV show that shipwrecked the 7 castaways, was named for Newton Minow. Sherwood Schwartz, the Gilligan's Island creator and executive producer, thought that Newton Minow was ruining TV. Hey, a couple of things that happened in 1961. If you had kids in 1961, no more cloth diapers. No more cloth diapers. You could have Pampers. I did this talk in Chicago last week, and a woman said to me, you know, my sister didn't believe in Pampers. She had kids in 1961, 62, 63, so did I. We had the good old cloth diapers. What were we thinking? Baseball changes in 1961. There's an expansion, and the expansion adds 2 teams to the American League. The Washington Senators expansion team replacing the old one that moved to Minnesota, and the Los Angeles Angels, which meant that Roger Maris, you might remember Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle, the great home run race of 1961. There is Maris after he hits his 61st home run. Sal Durante caught the ball out in right field, gives the ball back to Roger. '61, there are 18 major league teams. The American League adopts a 162-game schedule, and that causes all sorts of havoc with the commissioner of baseball, Ford Frick, who happened to be a sports writer at one time and a good friend of Babe Ruth. And Ford Frick is kind of upset that Babe Ruth's home run record, 60 home runs in the season, is going to get eclipsed by Maris or Mantle. So he has a ruling. He says, listen, you can break the record, but you better do it in 154 games like the Babe did it. Because if you don't, then Babe's record still stands up and you just hit 61. On the last day of the season, Roger Maris hits home run number 61, but there is some controversy because he does it in the 162-game schedule. Ruth did it in 60 home runs in 1927 with a 54-game schedule. Eventually, it didn't matter. There would be others hitting more home runs, and eventually there was no asterisk. Babe Ruth was second to Maris, didn't say games played or whatever it was, and that's how the record book looked. Oh, Barbie Roberts got a boyfriend. Oh, Barbie, 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 you, Barbie, rather, you got a boyfriend. There is the Ken doll. The Ken doll is probably worth a lot of money at that point. And in your everyday life, electric toothbrushes were introduced. Barbie Roberts gets a boyfriend, Ken. Frito corn chips appear. You got corn chips in 1961. Oh, a couple other things that were going on. Cassius Clay is moving up the ladder. He had won the gold medal for the light heavyweight division in 1960 at the Rome Olympics, and Cassius Clay is becoming a serious contender for the heavyweight championship, even at the age of 19 in 1961. And oh, if you were in Liverpool, you got to see these guys play. The Beatles, ladies and gentlemen, here they are, the Beatles. But it's not the Beatles that you would see that were on the Sullivan Show in 1964. It's George Harrison, yeah, he's still there. Pete Best, the drummer, replaced by Ringo Starr in 1962. Paul McCartney, who's still around, he's there too, along with John Lennon. One show only, the Cavern Club, the Beatles. But the Beatles would play at the Cavern Club in 1961, 1962, and 1963 in Liverpool. The legacy of 1961, well, the civil rights movement would continue. Kennedy would do very little to support the cause in 1962 and 1963. The situation in Cuba would come to a head in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although that may have been overplayed, as we have found out many, many years later. The United States would continue to support Diem, South Vietnamese. There was talk about reforming the Electoral College. There was talk this year about reforming the Electoral College. The Senate Majority Leader, the Democrat, Mike Mansfield of Montana, said the Electoral College was out of date. In 2021, you hear people saying the Electoral College is out of date. And finally, Saddam Hussein would invade Iraq Kuwait. Iraq would invade Kuwait in 1990. I want to thank everybody for attending, and Wendy as well for bringing me here. My name is Evan Weiner. I am going to open it up for questions or comments.